Hello, my name is Kate Shea. I'm a global curriculum coordinator at the University of Arizona. And at the time of the application, I was also a graduate student in the MA TESOL program here at the University of Arizona. And so I had the good fortune of getting to embark on this professional journey with a number of experienced teachers while I was still kind of fresh off of my own curriculum and courses. When I think about my own experiences teaching English, I've had the good fortune and really privilege of being able to travel to other countries and teach English there, and also have taught in a number of different classrooms here in the US as well. And I think when we think about the spread of English globally, the fact that it's this lingua franca and used in so many industries, we have to acknowledge the roots of that spread too. Durble and Richards here did a meta-analysis of MA TESOL programs and the curriculum required of them, and found that many didn't focus on that post-colonial theory and critique and the recognition that English is really being spread because of that colonial heritage. And so as I think about my own profession and love of teaching English, I have to acknowledge that too, that that's the dynamic that brings me to many of my classrooms and learners to my classroom. And I'm increasingly better off because of those experiences I have in the class. They're often the most diverse places, multilingual, multicultural places that I'm able to enter. And I'm grateful for that and have to recognize that it's because of that past. When I think about the advantages of going to China as an English teacher, the reasons abound, really. If we think just the initial one, there are so many English language learners in China. I myself actually taught in China 5 years ago. I also work with Chinese international students now at the University of Arizona, and I will continue to have Chinese English language learners in my classroom, just given the sheer amount studying it due to national language policies and the number of language institutes available. And I think for me, reflecting on the fact that I actually had taught in China, not in any of the cities we visited, but in Western China in Sichuan province, for me, this trip was especially informative, even having had those experiences, because I suddenly saw the educational system in a new light. We visited many schools in Shanghai, and Beijing, and they were very different in contrast to the university I taught at in Sichuan, in Panzhihua. Greg mentioned the rural and urban divide that we discussed with the long train home. That was the case for many of my students. Their parents were migrant workers working in different cities, and they were often raised by grandparents. We went to the examination museum in Nanjing, and we also saw the Gaokao site. And for me, I left those experiences embarrassingly kind of thinking for the first time, what did it take my students to get to me at that freshman and sophomore year in Panzhihua? Because I didn't realize the challenge and those obstacles that were present just by being in the city where they were studying in high school. And so for me, this was really kind of a, cliche as it is, eye-opening experience. I had to reflect on that teaching experience 5 years prior and realize I hadn't really considered what had led my students to me. Another very poignant part of the trip for me was the Historical Refugee Resettlement Center in Shanghai. This was where about several 10,000 of Jewish refugees were resettled during World War II. So here I have some of the photos from that center and my own journal entry, kind of my doodle and rant I did afterwards. So here you can see I have some quotes that kind of frustrated me for days later. Specifically that there's still almost 25 million refugees worldwide, and only 1 in 500 are resettled. And so this is still an issue, even as we look at these past historical events. And this was especially poignant for me because at the time, I was teaching the refugee education program based in Tucson. And I should give a shout out because Megan is here and she kindly subbed for me while I was in China, so thank you. A little bit of background about the refugee education program. It is housed in Pima Community College under the Adult Basic Education Program. And it provides free English courses for recently arrived refugees for their first 5 years in the US. And so in my classroom, much of my English teaching experience, very multicultural, multilingual, and diverse. I can have a student from 18 to 67. Some of them might have been, and actually some of them were, educators in their own country. They're well-versed in the abilities and skills needed to learn well Others are coming from limited or interrupted formal education. They might be coming from a war-torn area or had limited access to education. And so when I was thinking about what kind of curriculum I wanted to bring to my students, I wanted to really use this as a chance to position them as the experts in the class. So by introducing another culture, I wanted it to ultimately prepare them to share their own with their classmates. So I know it's somewhat of a cliche and superficial way to introduce culture, but it's also an appropriate one. And when you think about the level my students are at, being able to, say eating preferences is a very, skilled survival skill. We also did ordinal numbers, imperatives, commands, sequencing, and transitional verbs. So I brought in a few experts, cultural insiders, to share their process. And rather than share the student photos from the event, because I want to be cognizant of the fact that they might not understand that I was sharing it, to everyone and they'd be live streamed, I want to just kind of document what that pedagogy would look like given this group of learners. So my classmate Shini is also an ESL teacher, so she's also well-versed in this approach, and we use what was called language experience approach. And the idea is that much like our L1 is acquired, we start by listening and speaking before we move to literacy. But so often these adult learners are asked to master that literacy right off because we're in a highly literate environment. And so instead of approaching it as a story first or a handout, we start with an experience. And so together we cooked food in class, and then we craft a co-constructed story based off the photos from that. So again, I'll just kind of go through this. This isn't the final product that our class would have created, but it kind of shows you the process. So we're taking an action. We might introduce the verbs using total physical response, and then we're crafting sentences together. So this is just an example of it. These same kind of lessons, though, this idea that any kind of instruction needs to be informed with the context and with our students' individual identities in mind, also continues to influence my current work. And also my continued studies, too. So I think it's really important that as I continue to learn and grow, this idea of informing ESL curriculum starts with us as instructors. We have to continue to grow as instructors to really help our students. And so I'm continuing to work on that, reviewing literature and identity and language learning and intersectional pedagogy, and then some professional connections that stem from it as well. These are additional journal entries. And then I will let Amanda discuss our current work with UA Global, where we use English medium instruction at different microcampuses across the globe.
As mentioned, my name is Amanda Agate. My title at UA Global at the University of Arizona is Coordinator of Global Student Engagement. Very general title, so I'll go into what that means exactly. So me and Kate, as mentioned, we both work at UA Global at U of A, and we have an initiative that's called the Microcampus Initiative. And what that is we have microcampuses, as this map kind of shows. We have smaller U of A's that we partner with institutions that are already established in other countries throughout the world. At those partner institutions, we have students that are able to get a dual degree. They get one degree from their home institution where they're already going, and they also get a bachelor's degree alongside that from the University of Arizona that's American accredited. My job is I am the first instructor that they have actually within that dual degree program, and I teach a student success course. I'm not going to read all of this, but it is uploaded online, of course. The student success course is a year long. It's kind of like a student orientation, but so much more because all of these students are having to be introduced to the U.S. education system and U of A and how North Americans usually go to school within that education system. So my job is to cover a lot of things, and I never really have sometimes, but most of the time I never see these students or have the opportunity to teach them face to face because they are all over, so I am an online instructor. The purpose of this course, it is their first college course in general most of the time. And for our Chinese students, my students at our UA Qingdao campus, it's their first course most likely that's taught in English that is not an English language course. So in order for me to build curriculum for all of these different types of students coming from different countries with various English backgrounds and knowledge from all different places, it is pretty hard for me to create just one curriculum for all of them. So the goal of this course, pretty much what I do is I'm trying to provide an opportunity to learn from my students, kind of where they're coming from, at the same time establishing U of A policies as well as the structure of the US higher education system in general. Some of my module topics were created, well, actually all of my module topics, I had a set curriculum that was created before my Fulbright Hays China experience. And some of the assignments now have changed that I'll go into, but they were, I guess it's fair to say, naively created. I tried really hard to be open-minded when creating this curriculum, but my China experience showed me a lot of lessons. So examples of some of them that I thought everybody would maybe possibly know, or that I can easily explain at least, we're using Panopto, which is a tech software that we're really familiar with at U of A because we use D2L as our online platform. We also use VoiceThread, and we often do reflections through discussions since it is an online course. So I wasn't sure if anybody would be familiar with these when creating them. So my gained knowledge, a lot of stuff obviously was learned from my China experience, but mostly I learned about the education system there and what that means to students. And since I had students in Qingdao, I now was able to realize what education meant to them by actually seeing it face to face. I learned that there's key values that Chinese students have that are learned from a very young age, and those values are also incorporated at home with families and friends, and they're just pretty much a set of standard values that are taught in the classroom that they take with them throughout their whole lives. And just some of them consist of memorization, independence, respect, hard work, focus, and success. All of these are very important, I think it's fair to say, to almost every single Chinese student. My professional identity, as mentioned before, we did field visits, school site visits, family peer visits, speakers, authentic life experience is probably what I learned from the most. It was really hard to narrow down 3 main things that I learned because I also journaled a lot throughout the time. But one of the main things was understanding the perspective of not what my students see and do on a daily basis, but really understanding what education means to them. What does going to school mean to them? Are they pressured to get good grades or be successful in certain areas and careers? So I got to really understand that by all of our school visits and life experience. One of the main things also that I learned that's very, very significant in my curriculum development now is that certain activities can be stressors. Not all students are used to doing the same activities, and some of them can cause anxiety or even seem very inappropriate. And an example of that is I hold video office hours since I am an online teacher, and I realized very quickly why my Chinese students had never taken advantage of that opportunity, because their relationship with their instructors has been very different from what I was asking them to do. So that was important for me to know and to keep in mind. I can go into a lot of detail, but I'm not going to. Some of the values that I wanted to teach my Chinese students and also have an open conversation about so that I can learn from them. So I wanted to teach them co-independence. I wanted to give them memorization opportunities so that they can work. So some of the things that I tweaked when I got home that were already established before my trip, as I mentioned, group work. This concept is very different to a lot of Chinese students, especially online. What does group work look like? I'm trying now to incorporate different examples through video and different photos and examples so that they can learn that they can be co-independent in my online class, even if that's something that they're not used to, it is accepted. Memorization, I'm trying to incorporate a lot of quiz and testing and different opportunities for them to also learn in a way that they are used to. And we are also building student identity for them and just learning who they are within a U.S. online education higher ed system. These are all of our references. And I just wanted to take this time to call everyone up. They're welcome. We just wanted to say thank you very much for the opportunity for being here. Thank you to Circle. Thank you to the College of Humanities and East Asian Studies. And we are really privileged to be able to all come up here and speak about our personal identities and professionals lessons. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm helping with the microphone.
It's just addressed to anyone that you can answer. Since we're talking about learning culture, I'm a language teacher, so I'm curious, do you have any particular techniques that can combat the normal way of teaching culture, like not stereotype it, and also put a little more critical lens into it? Thank you.
I teach writing, but a big part of my coursework is critical thinking. And especially when I was introducing to my students a lot of the content around China, what I actually did was we started with stereotypes. We started with, like, what are the things that you know? What are the things you think you know? What are images that you associate like this history with? And that became, what it did was it created this space for us to talk about what we thought we knew, what my students assumed, and how assumption versus knowledge is actually a really critical thing when we're looking not just at cultures, but at pretty much any kind of fact or any kind of like learning context. It was a way for us to talk about shortcuts. These stereotypes were shortcuts for understanding. And so by kind of trying to address those stereotypes or those kind of assumptions first, it allowed us to say, like, well, these are things that I think I know. And how do we know those? From movies or from TV or, like from pop culture. And it gives us a chance to also talk about how those images are oversimplified or sanitized, or they're politicized and they have an agenda in and of themselves. And so that way we could, it set up conversations later. So with my students, when we were talking about Gaokao, we got away from the idea of, oh, well, all the Chinese kids in my class were really smart, so all Chinese are just naturally smart. And it allowed us to really start to see nuances. And so I think by really confronting a lot of those kind of like assumptions about culture and throwing them up on the board and then deconstructing them and showing how these were either purposefully given to them or they were just basically questions that hadn't been articulated as questions about these cultures or about these people that they didn't have a lot of experience with. It allowed us to have more authentic learning and also gave them springboards into their own questions and things they wanted to find out more about.
I just want to tack on a quick thing, too, that I've done, and it's bringing in cultural insiders. Because we all spent 1 month over the summer, and even with a year prior, I'm by no means a cultural expert. I'm trying to, far from it. And so that is why I had other guests come to my class. Because I think it's important for then my students to see that other people are being positioned as the experts when I'm asking them to then share their culture, too.
From a middle school perspective, we also talk about stereotypes. In fact, we do that at the end of, or somewhere in the middle of our, when we're talking about culture, we actually have a unit where we talk about traits of culture and things like that. And then we sort of do something similar to what Mariah was describing, breaking down the ideas of stereotypes and asking students to identify those, probably, obviously not at the depth you would go into it at the college level, but that really helps then when we become engaged in studying. We actually have to study continents. So I have to teach Africa in a month and just talk about potential for oversimplification. But that's my curriculum. And of course, as we discussed in the public schools, as Madison mentioned, whether you want to be or not, you have certain benchmarks you have to hit and things you have to meet. What Kate mentioned, we have, and what I mentioned during my presentation, our international student community has been extremely beneficial for me, being able to, as we start to study things, I try to bring in students that I have relationship with. If possible, I try to bring in 2 or 3 students and then allow them to talk about their lives. And so even like, I'm friends with several of the girls who are from Oman, so before, as we study the Middle East, we talk about the stereotypes. Once we've talked about that, we return to that with every continent. Talk about what stereotypes do you have, what ideas do you have, those kinds of things. And then, so when the girls came in from Oman, they were from different kinds of families, different socioeconomic things. They had some similarities, but they could also talk about the differences. They were cultural insiders. And that helped a great deal for my students to, like Mariah said, start to see that nuance. But I reiterate constantly, there's no one representative of a culture. There's incredible diversity, and we try to point that out not only by looking at other cultures that we are studying, but also by examining diversity in our own classroom.
Any other questions? All right, well, if there's no other questions or comments, let's do another round of applause for our wonderful symposium, very informative and reflective.